Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often, it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
Each bit of information delivers that to the whole jigsaw.
I was able to test that sample and I got a DNA profile.
There's no doubt at all that forensics were absolutely crucial in this case.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science were able to bring some of our most dangerous and despicable killers to justice.
This was such an unnatural crime.
It's not a question of if he will kill again, it's a question of when.
He believed that he was invincible and that nothing could stop him.
We'll hear how some of the toughest and most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
When you begin a forensic investigation, you don't know what you're going to find.
The officer plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
From the type of insects that were around, she'd been dead for at least 5 years.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man.
In this episode, a missing couple raises alarm bells.
They'd just gone off the map. It wasn't right. It wasn't right at all.
Bizarre twists that turn the investigation on its head.
It was all baloney. There wasn't a shred of truth in it.
And the science that could crack the case.
The amount of blood that I saw led me to believe that somebody had been seriously injured there.
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer. One of the largest reservoirs in England, Rutland Water covers an area of over 11.5 square kilometres of the country's smallest county. Created in 1976, it's been a haven for wildlife, as well as people seeking peace and tranquility from nearby Leicester and Peterborough ever since.
In the day, it's an extremely busy place. It's popular with the dog walkers, fishermen, cyclists, plenty of cyclists around. But then at night, you know, you wouldn't expect to see anything. The car parks are all closed off. So to see any movement in here or around here at night is quite unusual, really.
Back in 1993, Richard Hallam was a daily visitor to the reservoir.
I was 21 at the time, and I was working at a local country club. Part of my job was to work on the night shift so that we could reassemble rooms overnight, change projectors, cameras, that kind of stuff for delegates the next day. Also on the night shift, there's a security guy that would work with us as well. And occasionally we would swap duties, help each other out. He did some of my work, I did some of his work. And the particular night in question, I said to the guy, I said, you know, do you want me to do your patrol? He said, yeah, do my patrol. So part of the job was to walk around the site, check in at various points around the country club, one of which was the gatehouse. It must have been 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, something like that. Walking back to the country club from the gatehouse, I looked over the water and I could see a car going down the track that you can see over there. Side lights on, not main headlights, just the side lights, but making its way down this track that you can see through the trees over there, making its way along to what we know as Armley Woods, which is just over there. I thought it was odd, but other than that, never really twigged, you know, just carried on with the patrol. At that time, of course, you know, there was no inquiry, there was nobody missing or anything like that. So it was just one of those things, you know. It is the first time that I've been back to this spot since that November in '93, and strange and quite chilling feeling, really, you know.
With a population of less than 800,000, Rutland is hardly a crime hotspot, and it's one of the quieter beats for Leicestershire Constabulary, which police the county.
Rutland itself It was a very rural area, beautiful countryside, and of course we'd got the reservoir, which was a massive tourist attraction. So you were getting people there from all different walks of society.
Back in 1993, former Detective Chief Superintendent Steve Johnson was the area commander in Rutland.
You could sort of count the number of crimes that they'd have there on your hand. And if there was a crime, everybody knew about it, and everybody seemed to know what everybody else was doing. It was a very sort of insular sort of existence there for people. There were quite a lot of retired people who obviously came there to see out their years because it was such a quiet, beautiful place to live.
Two of those retired people were 68-year-old Derek and 69-year-old Eileen Severs, who'd moved to the area from York several years earlier.
The Severs family were very well known. Derek and Eileen lived quite an affluent lifestyle. They'd settled into the community in Rutland, and Derek liked to pint at his local pub, the Finches, and he went everywhere in his Blue Rover because he had mobility problems. He'd retired but still did little bits of work here and there. Mrs. Severs was very active. She was involved in all the charitable groups locally, and her involvement even led to her being awarded an MBE for helping prisoners at the local prison, HMP Ashwell.
Well-known, well-liked and well-meaning, the Severs had a busy social life. But in November 1993, this active couple unexpectedly dropped off the Rutland Water radar.
The first people to start raising alarms were friends and people from different clubs and societies that the Severs family belonged to. They were involved in lots of community activities and fundraising for charities, etc. And because of that, they were creatures of habit. They were very punctual when they went to places. And on this occasion, I do believe that Mrs. Severs had made arrangements to deliver raffle prizes from a fundraising event, and she hadn't turned up.
They went missing on Saturday, and by Thursday, the 18th of November, people were worried and anxious about where they were.
With concerns raised, police initially treated Derek and Eileen's case as a missing persons inquiry.
When people went missing, there were set procedures, really. An officer would visit and make an initial assessment, and invariably people were found very quickly. So they never sort of progressed to the next stage, which would have been a more intensive checking up on all of their friends. Really, it was doing all the nuts and bolts to try and establish whether they'd gone voluntarily or whether there was something more suspicious that was going on.
As they took initial statements from worried friends of Derek and Eileen, they questioned them to establish a timeline for their last known movements.
The last sighting of Mrs. Severs was at a charity bazaar in Oakham at 1:30 p.m. on the 13th of November. The last sighting of Mr. Severs was that he'd had a pint in his local pub, the Finches, on the same day.
Most missing people are found safe and well within the first 24 hours. But 5 days had passed since anyone had seen or heard from Eileen and Derek. With concerns mounting, officers drove to their home for a closer look. When they arrived, somebody answered the door. In November 1993, the tight-knit community living around picturesque Rutland Water was growing concerned about the whereabouts of two popular residents, Derek and Eileen Severs.
The picture that evolved was again strengthening the case for a full investigation, because Never in all the years that they'd lived there and all the people they knew had they just gone off the map.
When officers arrived at Derek and Eileen's home, the door was opened by their son, 37-year-old Roger Severs.
Roger was somebody I knew back in '93 from the Lamici wine bar. Particularly when I was back home from university, I used to go down there for a beer or two a couple of times a week, and I knew people there, and we would chat about golf and music or whatever the issue was of the day.
To the young Nick Beggy, Roger cut a respectable figure.
He was well dressed. I can picture in my head now with his chinos, trousers, and blazer, and open neck shirt, and. He told us he was a grain buyer for Weetabix, and I can remember that very, very clearly.
Like his parents, Roger came across as a likeable and sociable character, and there was nothing to suggest that what he told the police at his parents' home was anything but true.
Roger said, oh, they've gone away for a week. He said that he'd dropped them off at Peterborough station and they'd taken a train south. And the last that he'd heard was a phone call from his mum on the 16th of November, which was 2 days before the officers visited.
2 days off the map is better than 5 days. But despite reassurances from Roger, police remained concerned about where Derek and Eileen might be and continued their missing persons investigation.
One of the neighbours told them that if they went away, they always came round and said, look after the house, do this, do that. They hadn't done that. But the police did an extensive investigation as to where they might have disappeared. So they went down to Peterborough, which is where they would have caught the train from, to go down to London, and they made inquiries there. Nobody had seen them. And they went to King's Cross just to double-check, which is the destination station, and there was nothing there either. Absolutely no sign of them.
At that time, there was no CCTV on the platforms in the stations. We didn't even have mobile phones. That made it a more difficult inquiry because everything had to be done the hard way. There was no technology, really, to assist.
While investigators made inquiries at hotels in the area they left for, they continued to speak to close friends of Derek and Eileen.
All of their friends looked mystified that, no, they can't have gone on holiday because she's supposed to be delivering the raffle prizes. He's supposed to be coming down the pub. Because if they were going on holiday, they would have told everybody.
The friends didn't just have lots to say about Derek and Eileen going on holiday. They also had lots to say about their son, Roger. He too was well known in the community.
Roger went on dates with people he met through the Lonely Hearts column, and he'd spin a real load of lies to them, pretending to be a big shot. And the truth is, he had a few menial jobs and hadn't even held on to them for very long. So he came out with elaborate stories of successes for big companies, business deals, claimed to have a flash motor, but it was always in the garage being fixed. He masqueraded as a high-flying businessman who just clinched a good deal. He'll tell everyone, I'm celebrating this success. And it was all baloney. There wasn't a shred of truth in it.
It was becoming pretty obvious that there was a certain level of disappointment from the family with their son, Roger. He'd had a good education. I think he went to public school and they expected more. His father had always been a high flyer.
He had never kept a job for more than a month or two normally. He was considered to be a huge disappointment to his parents, who'd been very, very successful in their own lives. And Roger turned out to be a layabout, lazy, didn't do whatever they wanted. And so they had stopped giving him money because they were fed up of giving him money because it was just going down the drain.
But there was more than just unmet expectations that was causing tension between Roger and his parents. There was also a recent fallout about finances.
Roger kept sponging off his parents. And in the end, they got fed up. He wanted quite a lot of money for his latest business venture, and they said, stop, that's enough. We've paid all your debts, you've never actually succeeded in anything, we don't want to lose any more money on a wasted venture, so you're not having it.
Rumours also swirled that Derek and Eileen wanted to cut Roger from their will in favour of their grandson. Could this be a motive to murder? Roger's possible motive now made him a person of interest in his parents' disappearance. Officers paid him another visit at Derek and Eileen's home. This time, they asked to come inside for a closer look.
A detective sergeant asked for permission to search the house, and the house was untidy. These were people who had a spotlessly clean house, everything had a place, everything had a home in the house, and it was untidy, and more alarm bells started to sound. The sergeant and the constable who went with him noticed that the bathroom carpet and the kitchen carpet were both missing.
When officers questioned Roger about the carpet, he claimed his dad had dropped a chip pan, and that's why that section of carpet was missing. And again, the bathroom was the result of a spill, and he just passed it off as just being normal.
Roger's story was suspicious, but with no evidence linking him to his parents' disappearance, there was little the officers could do. Elsewhere, though, detectives had made a breakthrough. A police report, totally unconnected to the case, had been discovered and offered vital new clues.
On Monday, November the 15th, at about 6:30, two officers were on their way to a call when they noticed Derek Severs' Blue Rover, which seemed out of place, and someone near it acting suspiciously. They stopped and asked him what he was doing. He said he was answering a call of nature, but they noticed there were some fertiliser bags nearby. And when questioned about those, he said he was looking for leaves to collect for leaf mould.
That person was Roger Severs. Steve and his team wasted no time rushing to the area where Roger had been seen acting suspiciously in Derek's car, hoping for a break in the case. A search of the site revealed no hard evidence. But where else had Roger been in Derek's distinctive car that day? Again, police reports held more clues, this time from a traffic officer's logbook.
Traffic officers had a nose, as good a nose as detectives for seeing things that were out of place. And this log told us that they'd seen this car at a rubbish tip and that they'd seen Roger Severs with it. And it gave them an explanation which was believable, that he was just dropping stuff off. But they made a record of it. And because of that, the officers submitted this record. We had to then send a search team, and we sent our tactical unit to actually search this tip.
A meticulous forensic search began at the tip, looking for evidence that could connect Roger with the disappearance of his parents.
They were there for several days, going through every single bag and every article on this tip, and a really dirty job. And they did turn up some things. There was a blood-stained towel. Could be anybody's, couldn't be tied in.
Another blank. Now, a week into the investigation, Steve and his team were no closer to tracking down Derek and Eileen Severs. And with every passing day, the chances of finding them safe and well diminished. In November 1993, the small community of Rutland Water were growing increasingly concerned for Derek and Eileen Severs, a married couple who had now been missing for a week. The Severs' son, Roger, had told police his parents were away visiting London, a story detectives weren't convinced by when they'd spoken to him at his parents' home.
Everybody who went to the house said, although we got nothing, there was always this feeling, it was a general feeling, that it just wasn't right. The detectives were aware that there were carpets missing in the bathroom and the kitchen, and the excuses that had been given by the son for their absence were a little bit thin. They didn't seem to really fit.
Investigators were now becoming increasingly worried that Derek and Eileen had come to harm.
Everything pointed to the fact that there'd been foul play, because it was sort of a week on from the last contact with anybody, and that was another major concern. If it had been a day, 2 days, you can deal with that. A week, you know that you're not going to find them alive, and that is always heart-wrenching, really, because a missing person inquiry is now a murder inquiry.
And the man Leicestershire police believed could be responsible for the disappearance of Derek and Eileen was their son, Roger. But they still didn't have any hard evidence to prove that Roger had killed his parents.
Even though the evidence wasn't conclusive, it was all circumstantial. It was all pointing in the direction that the parents had been killed. He was the prime suspect.
Steve and his team had to take a huge gamble, which could risk blowing any case against Roger.
And because we got no bodies, but also because of the fact that there was always a chance that Roger might try and leave the country, he was arrested on suspicion of murder, which again was something that was unusual. But if we'd let him go, who knows where he'd have ended up, whether we'd have managed to get him back. It was a really odd case.
Steve's decision to formally arrest Roger did provide investigators with an opportunity to strengthen the case against him.
To move things on, we really needed to get into that house and to do a proper forensic search of the property. And the only way we could achieve that, because he wasn't consenting to that sort of search, was to actually arrest him on suspicion of the murder, and that would in turn give us the opportunity to get into the house and do a proper forensic search of the property.
Steve had rolled the dice and now relied on his forensic team to find the evidence that could link Roger to the suspected murder of Derek and Eileen.
My role in Leicestershire Constabulary at the time was the crime scene manager. So effectively, if there's any serious crime, then I would be called in to manage all the sort of various angles that needed to be done. Normally I would get called in when there was a body or some very serious offence had taken place, but this was a little bit unusual because it was very much a case of, well, we don't quite know what's happened. We had a set of circumstances, and obviously we wanted to get more information as to what we thought could have actually happened. It didn't look bright because they'd been missing for a while, but we had an open mind about the whole thing. As a crime scene investigator, one is always looking out for any evidence that might give more credence to one story or another story.
The crime scene search was soon uncovering interesting and unusual documents that reinforced investigators' suspicions about Roger.
The police found an important piece of evidence during the search, and it was Roger's 14-point to-do list. Wheelbarrow clean, rubbish, mum's car clean, dad's car clean, clean bathroom, check shed, pictures, fire, check it's out, deliver other prize, check hotels, ashes, cut down shrubs, point 13 little garage, and point 14 dump.
Were these mundane household chores to tick off, or a murderer's to-do list? And could Roger's clean-up plans mean forensic evidence had been wiped away. Undeterred, Orlando and his team first examined the bathroom, where some missing carpet had aroused suspicions on the officers' first search.
It was fairly obvious that this bathroom was not as it should be, inasmuch as all the carpets had been stripped and it was down to the bare wood. Having established there was something odd going on there, we then investigate the rest of the house in a similar sort of manner, going through each room and looking at it almost on hands and knees to see if there's any evidence of anything else that looks untoward.
While Orlando and other members of his team scoured through the rest of the property, on-call scientist Peter Lamb arrived on scene to inspect the bathroom in closer detail.
I began to examine the bathroom and toilet, and I noticed that there were 1 or 2 tiny specks of blood, but not in the usual place that you find blood in people's homes. You would normally expect to find blood on the carpets or the flooring, maybe on the tops of the sink, where if you cut yourself shaving, you might drip a piece of blood and then forget to wipe it up. But in this case, there was nothing like that. The fact that these were tiny pieces of blood was unusual, because if you cut yourself shaving and a drip forms and drips off, in forensic terms, that is a lot of blood. The tiny specks of blood which I was finding normally indicate some sort of blunt force injury. Now, we use a chemical enhancement technique, and on a lot of surfaces where I couldn't see any blood whatsoever, I was getting a very weak positive reaction, which tends to suggest that there was blood there to start with, but somebody has made an attempt to clean it off.
The blood spatter is something, but the attempt to clean the blood is worrying. As they suspected, the killer had clearly taken time to destroy any forensic evidence. But, as Peter quickly discovered, they hadn't covered up all of their tracks.
And I decided, strangely enough, to lay on the floor and look up. When I lay on the floor and looked up, I could see blood staining underneath the toilet, underneath the sink, and on the return edges of the bath fascia panel. They were the type of blood staining that you would expect if blood had run down these areas, pooled underneath and started to drip from those areas. The faces that you could see from standing up or sitting down, they'd all been cleaned. But the underneaths, where you wouldn't see if you were in those positions, hadn't been cleaned at all. This tended to suggest that originally there was quite a lot of blood had been shed. The amount of blood that I saw led me to believe that somebody had been seriously injured there. The amount of blood that potentially was there that had been cleaned up was a life-threatening amount of blood, I would suggest.
Finally, police had forensic evidence to suggest an attack had taken place in the bathroom. But obviously, there was no body at the scene, meaning it must have been moved, crucially leaving a forensic trail in blood.
I searched the flooring between there and the exits, and although there was no visible blood along that route, I used the chemical enhancement technique and found traces of blood which were invisible to the eye along most of the route between the bathroom, through the hallway, through the kitchen, and then into the garage, which was attached to the house.
The trail of blood wasn't the only forensic clue that Peter uncovered.
But whilst I was looking at that, I also found some fibres, a yellowy green looking fibre, tiny, barely visible to the naked eye, but they had the appearance of rolled up hay bales that you see in fields. You know, the finding of fibres in itself is probably not unusual, but the appearance of these was particularly unusual in this instance. That, together with not being able to find any blood from somebody who was clearly bleeding heavily, led me to believe that maybe the person had been wrapped in something and dragged through the house. The scenes of crime officers had finished their work, pulled the garage door down, and they'd noticed that there was some blood staining on the outside of the garage door. So I had a look at it, tested it, it was certainly blood, and the distribution of it was such that, again, in my view, somebody had been beaten repeatedly. So there'd been blows into wet blood, which had caused the blood to spatter, and some of it had landed on the garage door. That could have only happened when the garage door was closed, not when it was open. That led to the decision that either two people had been injured in separate areas, or the person who'd been injured in the bathroom had been able to get up and then had been further assaulted outside. And it wasn't until we'd done some preliminary blood typing that we were able to say that it was two people who were involved in this. One person had been assaulted outside near the garage door, and another person had been assaulted inside the house in the bathroom.
Forensic investigators had now found significant evidence to suggest this was definitely a murder inquiry, not a missing persons search. But the question still remained. Where were Derek and Eileen, and what had happened to them? Police in England's smallest county had been investigating the disappearance of a retired couple, Derek and Eileen Severs, for 2 weeks. Forensic evidence suggested they had been murdered in their home in rural Rutland Water. The prime suspect, their 37-year-old son, Roger. However, there was still one important part of the case against him that was missing. Police had still not found their bodies.
Rutland was a massive area. It's often easier to search a more residential area than it is a rural area. We've just got masses of open fields and water. I mean, we've got the lake there. Who was to say that they hadn't gone out in a boat and weighted and dumped into the reservoir? It was, it really was, you know, wet your finger and stick it in the air, and where do we start?
The starting point turned out to be not far from the Severs' home, their back garden.
Mr. Severs was a very keen gardener, and when they were searching the house, they found in the garden that there were traces where soil had been removed, which again seemed unusual, not frighteningly unusual, but unusual that there was quite an amount of soil that was missing.
Had the soil been removed to create a shallow grave? Officers dug into the soil, expecting to find the bodies of the Severs. But the garden wasn't a graveyard after all. Officers might have been frustrated by their search of the garden, but the garage was about to yield more answers. Notably, Derek's pride and joy, his blue Rover.
What seemed odd to me at the time was that it looked a little bit muddy, a little bit grubby, but when we looked in through the window onto the dashboard, we could see that there was a whole series of cleaning tokens. And this family were really scrupulously clean. So this seemed really quite odd to me. It seemed very, very strange that you got all these cleaning tokens and yet the car was muddy and grubby. This is something that piqued my interest, sort of thinking, this isn't quite right. You know, this doesn't fit the theory I have of the people that lived here and how they lived. So it became quite a focal point quite quickly as to what's happening here. So obviously this looks interesting, more interesting than if it was just any old car. We then examined it and there were traces of mud on the inside smeared, and there was also positive for bloodstains as well in the boot. The hypothesis was that perhaps this car had been used to remove the bodies from the house.
The forensic search of the crime scene suggested that both Derek and Eileen were now dead. But where were their bodies? In a bid to find their location, detectives needed to turn up the heat on Roger, now being questioned in police custody.
Two of our best interviewers, they had a really good go at him over a long period of time, and he just wasn't budging. He was sticking to the same old story, and a decision had still got to be made, because you either let him go or you charge him, because things were starting to stack up against him. So he was charged without a confession, without a body.
And without that confession, investigators had to go back to the drawing board. Based on the evidence they did have, crime scene manager Orlando Elmhurst had an idea to narrow down the search area. Once again, Derek's car would provide the clues.
The wheel arches, in particular, were caked in mud, and I thought that that could potentially hold some information that we could progress with. I thought, right, well, let's contact the archaeology department. I phoned them up and sort of said, look, is there anything or anyone there who could do anything with mud? Because obviously we have the situation of these missing people and we are desperate to find them. And after a few phone calls, I ended up talking to Dr. Tony Brown, who said that he thought he could do something with it.
Could this mud lead detectives to the murdered couple?
It was about 2 weeks later that Tony Brown got back in contact with us, and he sort of constructed an environmental profile from the contents of the soil on the wheel arches. That the scene would be a road verge or parking place by water, as used by fishermen, in or adjacent to woodland with a significant proportion of oak, horse chestnut, ash and lime. The wood edge also borders onto arable fields and pastures and located on or adjacent to soils derived from Lincolnshire limestone. So he's giving us a very good particular environmental picture of where we should be looking. He had some places in mind that he thought could be viable and would fit that description, and he would then try and narrow that number down to see if he could pinpoint where it could have come from. He ultimately pinpointed 3 potential sites: Exton Wood, and there's Hamilton Wood, and there was Armley Wood. We could then hone our search area, and within 2 days, they'd struck lucky.
I believe that the officer actually felt the earth moving under his feet, and then plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
3 weeks after they were last seen, investigators had found Derek and Eileen Severs.
When you find bodies, there's mixed feelings really. One is sadness, obviously, because we knew in our heart of hearts that they were dead. So finding them, it confirmed that. So there is a sadness, but at the same time, there's an elation as well, because you know that you've got the right person. Everything that's been done by everybody working together has led you to this conclusion.
But it wasn't just the bodies of Derek and Eileen that investigators had found. Other pieces of the puzzle also fell into place.
When they found the bodies, they were able to compare the soil in the garden with the soil at the scene and actually say 100% this came from the Severs garden.
It would seem a reasonable assumption to suggest that some of that soil had been taken away. Again, perhaps it was too difficult to dig a deep enough hole to put the 2 bodies in, together with a blanket and other things. And so soil was taken from the property and used to fill over like that.
And the soil wasn't the only forensic match found in this shallow grave by the water's edge.
The bodies were wrapped in yellowy green blankets, and these blanket fibres matched little bits of piles that we'd seen in the hallway.
It would also explain why there wasn't a lot of blood on the carpets and on the flooring, because the majority of it would have been absorbed by, as we know it now, a blanket, a thick blanket.
News of the shocking discovery soon rippled across Rutland and was particularly significant for Richard Hallam, who had spotted a strange car just weeks prior.
When I realised that the bodies had been found over in the woods, and I then put the two and two together, it was just an absolute, my God, something that I thought was a little bit strange at the time, to all of a sudden realising, my goodness me, you know, it could have been Roger with his parents in the car. It arouses all sorts of emotions, you know.
Even after the bodies were found, for many, the discovery only led to more questions.
I just wonder what went through their minds when they thought they were going to die at the hands of their own son, their own flesh and blood. This was such an unnatural crime. We're programmed to care for our parents in dotage, and he took the lives from the people who gave him his own life. Their kindness and their love over many years, the support, the money that they poured into his useless business ventures, and how does he repay them? He murders them in cold blood so he can have their luxury lifestyle for himself.
A year later, the case went to trial at Nottingham Crown Court. Based on all of the forensic evidence, prosecutors put forward what they believed happened on the 13th of November, 1993.
During an argument with his mother in the house, he took a steak mallet and repeatedly beat her about the head. Derek drove home, and we know that he was ambushed by his son. Roger Severs brutally bludgeoned his father to death in the garage of the home and left him to die.
The overwhelming forensic evidence was enough to convince the jury that Roger Severs was guilty. He was given 2 life sentences in December 1994.
When you've got so little to go on, it was really the science that actually took us there, and that's the amazing thing about science. It moves on, doesn't it?
The use of forensic science, and particularly using it in this novel way, really moved on that inquiry quite significantly. It is possible that the bodies would not have been discovered for ages, in which case all the other evidence which could have pointed to a particular killer would have disappeared.